When billionaire Ethan Langford hails a late-night cab, he never expects the driver to be Zariah Bennett, the woman he once turned down for a top position at his company. But as their worlds collide again, Ethan is about to realize just how wrong he was and how one ride could change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The New York City skyline glittered against the night as Ethan Langford stood at his office window. At 42, he had built Langford Enterprises into a billion-dollar technology empire through sheer determination and an unwavering focus on results. His corner office on the 52nd floor overlooked Manhattan, a daily reminder of how far he'd come from his humble beginnings. "Mr. Langford, the board is waiting in the conference room," his assistant said from the doorway. Ethan straightened his tie. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." When the door closed, he took a deep breath. Tonight's meeting would finalize their biggest acquisition yet, a merger that would make headlines and secure his legacy. He had worked 18 months for this moment. The conference room fell silent when Ethan entered. 8 board members in expensive suits watched as he took his place at the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we make history." The meeting dragged for hours. Lawyers presented documents, executives debated terms, and Ethan maintained control of it all. By 11 o'clock, champagne was being poured. "To Langford Enterprises," his CFO toasted. And to Ethan, the man who never takes no for an answer. Everyone cheered, but Ethan only managed a tight smile. Success always felt hollow in these moments, with no one to share it with besides employees paid to celebrate his victories. Later, after everyone had gone, Ethan gathered his briefcase and headed for the elevator. The building was nearly empty, the cleaning crews quietly moving through the offices. Outside, rain had started to fall. Ethan pulled up his collar against the November chill and glanced at his watch, nearly midnight. His driver had gone home hours ago with instructions to pick him up in the morning. Normally, he would have called for the company car service, but tonight he just wanted to get home without more conversation. He stepped to the curb and raised his hand to hail a passing taxi. A yellow cab pulled over immediately. Ethan climbed in, grateful to escape the rain. "East 72nd Street, please, the Hamilton Building." "Got it," the driver replied, pulling into traffic. Something about the voice made Ethan look up. In the rearview mirror, he caught the driver's eyes. Warm brown, framed by a face he couldn't immediately place, but somehow recognized. The driver was a woman, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. She navigated the wet streets with confidence, her hands steady on the wheel. When she glanced in the mirror again and saw him watching, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Long night at Langford Enterprises?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Ethan stiffened. "Do I know you?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I'm not surprised you don't remember. I'm Zariah Bennett. I interviewed with you about 2 years. Sagos?" The name hit Ethan like a slap. Of course, Zariah Bennett. He remembered now, the woman who had impressed everyone on his hiring team, but failed to impress him. He'd overruled his staff and rejected her application personally. "Ms. Bennett," he said, discomfort creeping into his voice. "I do remember." "No need for that," she replied, eyes back on the road. It was a long time ago, but it hadn't been. Not really. And now here she was, driving a taxi at midnight while he returned from signing a multi-billion-dollar deal. "You're driving cabs now?" he asked, immediately regretting how it sounded. "Among other things," she said, her tone even. "I do what I need to do." Ethan fell silent, watching her profile as she concentrated on the traffic. She was younger than him, maybe early 30s, with a quiet dignity that made him feel suddenly small despite his wealth. His phone buzzed, a text from his assistant. "Congratulations on the merger. The PR team needs quotes for tomorrow's press. Release." He put the phone away without answering. For some reason, he couldn't focus on work right now. "This is a late shift," he said, attempting conversation. "It's not my usual," Zariah explained. "My regular shift is during school hours when my daughter's in class, but medical bills don't pay themselves." The statement hung in the air between them. "Your daughter is sick?" Ethan asked. "Asthma. She had a bad attack last week. She's okay now. But the ER visit wasn't cheap, even with my part-time insurance." Ethan nodded, discomfort growing. He remembered more clearly now. Zariah had been applying for a director position in marketing. Her resume had been impressive. MBA from a state school, solid experience at smaller firms. But he'd wanted someone from one of the top 5 universities, someone with Fortune 500 experience, someone like himself. "Here we are," Zariah announced, pulling up to his luxury building. Rain drummed against the roof of the cab as Ethan reached for his wallet. He pulled out several bills, hesitated, then handed her twice the fare amount. "Keep the change," he said. Zariah looked at the money, then directly at him. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Langford." "It's not charity, it's a tip." "A guilty tip," she said, but took the money anyway. "But thank you. This will help with Zoe's medication." The name gave him pause. "Your daughter's name is Zoe?" "Yes. She's 8. Zariah's expression softened for the first time. "The light of my life." Something twisted in Ethan's chest. He had no children, no family at all since his parents passed. His closest relationship was with his executive assistant. "Ms. Bennett," he began, not sure what he wanted to say. "You should go inside before you get soaked," she interrupted. "Congratulations on your merger. I saw it on the business news." Ethan stepped out into the rain but turned back before closing the door. "Thank you for the ride." She nodded once and then she was gone, taillights disappearing into the rainy night. Inside his penthouse, Ethan poured himself a scotch and walked to the window. The city sprawled before him, millions of lives intersecting in ways he rarely considered. Somewhere out there, Zariah Bennett was driving through the rain to earn enough for her daughter's medicine. He loosened his tie, feeling it had been strangling him all evening. The merger document sat in his briefcase, his great triumph, but all he could think about was the look in Zariah's eyes when she'd recognized him. Not anger or resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement of how their paths had diverged because of his decision. His phone rang. It was Patricia, his VP of Human Resources. "Ethan, sorry to call so late. I just left the office and saw your light was still on. Did the meeting go well?" "Yes, everything's signed," he said, distracted. "That's wonderful. We'll start the transition team tomorrow. Oh, and I wanted to remind you that we still haven't filled the Community Relations Director position. The last candidate withdrew this morning." Ethan stopped pacing. "Patricia, do we still have the applications from 2 years ago?" "The marketing director search. Somewhere in the archives, I suppose. Why?" "There was a woman, Zariah Bennett. Can you pull her file tomorrow?" "Bennett?" Patricia sounded surprised. "I remember her. You were quite adamant about not hiring her, even though the team liked her." "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I made a mistake." The silence on the other end told him how rarely he admitted such things. "I'll find her file," Patricia finally said. "But Ethan, that was 2 years ago. She's probably employed elsewhere by now." "She's driving a taxi," he said quietly, "at midnight, to pay for her daughter's medical bills." Another long pause. "I see. I'll have her information on your desk first thing tomorrow." After hanging up, Ethan couldn't settle. He kept seeing Zariah's face in the rearview mirror, the quiet dignity with which she'd acknowledged their past interaction. Not the right fit he had written on her application. But what had that really meant? She hadn't gone to an Ivy League school like him, hadn't grown up with the right connections or opportunities, but she'd earned her degree while working full-time, built a solid career despite the odds. Maybe she'd been exactly the right fit, and he had been too blind to see it. The next morning, Patricia placed a folder on his desk. Zariah Bennett's application, as requested. "And I made some calls. She's working 3 jobs currently, the taxi at night, administrative assistant at a non-profit during the day and weekend. Shifts at a catering company." 3 jobs, Ethan repeated, the weight of it sinking in. "And she has a child. A daughter, according to her original application. She would be 8 now." Ethan opened the folder. Zariah's resume was exactly as he remembered, but now he saw it differently. Where he had once seen gaps, he now saw persistence. Where he had seen a lack of prestigious names, he now saw someone who had carved her own path without advantages. "The community relations position," he said. "What does it pay?" Patricia named a figure that was 3 times what Zariah likely made across all 3 jobs. "Schedule an interview." Patricia hesitated. "Ethan, are you sure? This feels, personal." "It is personal," he admitted. "I made a judgment about her that was wrong. I want to fix it. And if she doesn't want your help, people have pride." Ethan thought about the way Zariah had looked at the large tip he'd offered, like she both needed and resented it. "Then I'll have to convince her it's not help I'm offering," he said. "It's the opportunity she deserved 2 years ago." Later, that day, Ethan sat in a coffee shop near the non-profit where Zariah worked. Patricia had arranged for her to come at 1 p.m. during her lunch break. He'd insisted on meeting away from his office, neutral ground. At exactly 1 hour, the door opened and Zariah walked in. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, professional but far from the designer labels that filled the Langford Enterprises offices. Her hair was pulled back, and she carried herself with the same quiet confidence he'd noticed in the taxi. When she saw him, she stopped short. For a moment, he thought she might turn and leave. "Ms. Bennett," he said, standing. "Thank you for coming." "Your HR person was quite persistent," she replied, taking the seat across from him, "though she wouldn't tell me what this was about." "I want to offer you a job," Ethan said directly. "Director of Community Relations at Langford Enterprises." Zariah's expression didn't change, but he saw her hands tighten around her purse. "Why?" she asked simply. It was a fair question, and one for which Ethan had spent all night preparing an answer. But now facing her, all his practiced explanations felt hollow. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. 2 years ago, I made a decision based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had. I valued the wrong things. I missed what was important." Zariah studied him, her gaze unwavering. "And you expect me to be grateful now, to jump at this opportunity?" "No," he said honestly. "I expect you to be suspicious." "I would be. But the position is real. The salary is substantial, and the job would use the skills and experience you've built. This isn't charity, Ms. Bennett. It's business, correcting a business mistake I made." She took a sip of the water the waitress had brought. "And it has nothing to do with finding me driving a cab last night." "It has everything to do with that," he admitted, "but not in the way you think. Meeting you again made me see clearly what I was too blind to see before." For the first time, something in her expression softened slightly. "I have a daughter, Mr. Langford. I can't take risks with her security." "I understand. The position comes with full benefits, including excellent health insurance. The hours are flexible, and we have an on-site daycare." Zariah looked down at her hands, and Ethan could see her calculating, weighing options. "Why should I trust you now?" she finally asked. "What's changed?" Ethan realized he didn't have a good answer. What had changed? One brief encounter in a taxi, and suddenly he was offering her a job he'd denied her before. It sounded impulsive even to him. "I don't know if you should trust me," he said honestly, "but I'm asking you to consider the opportunity, despite your understandable doubts about my motives." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, Ethan felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "I'll think about it," Zariah said finally, standing to leave. "That's all I can promise right now." As she walked away, Ethan realized it was more than he deserved, and the first time in years someone hadn't simply given him what he wanted. He found himself hoping, more than he'd hoped for anything in a long time, that she would say yes. A week passed with no word from Zariah. Ethan found himself checking with Patricia multiple times a day, something completely out of character for him. Still nothing, Patricia told him on Friday afternoon. "Maybe you should consider other candidates." Ethan shook his head. "Give her more time." He tried to focus on the merger paperwork, but his mind kept drifting to Zariah. He had searched for her online and found almost nothing, just a LinkedIn profile with minimal information and a brief mention in a community newsletter about volunteer work at her daughter's school. That evening, as he was about to leave the office, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Langford, this is Zariah Bennett." Ethan sat back down at his desk. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for calling." "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, her voice steady. "I have some questions before I can make a decision." "Of course. Is this position being created just for me, or is it something your company actually needs?" It was a perceptive question. "We've needed this position for some time," Ethan answered honestly. "Our community outreach efforts are scattered across different departments. We need someone to coordinate them, build relationships with local organizations, and ensure our corporate giving has real impact." "And what makes you think I'm qualified now, when I wasn't 2 years ago?" Ethan grimaced. "As I said, I was wrong then. Your experience at the non-profit where you're working now actually makes you more qualified than before." There was a pause before Zariah spoke again. "I'd like to see a formal job description and details about compensation and benefits. I'll have Patricia send everything right away." "One more thing," Zariah added. "If I decide to take this position, I want it clear that I'll be evaluated on my performance only. No special treatment, no looking the other way if I fall short." "Agreed," Ethan said immediately. "I wouldn't respect you if I treated you differently than any other executive." "All right," she said. "I'll review the materials and let you know my decision by Monday." After they hung up, Ethan immediately called Patricia to make sure the job details were sent. Then he sat in his quiet office, surprised by how important this had become to him. The weekend dragged. Ethan usually spent Saturdays at the office and Sundays reading reports at home, but he found it impossible to concentrate. On Sunday afternoon, restless, he decided to take a walk through Central Park. The November air was crisp, leaves crunching under his feet as he followed the winding paths. Families were out enjoying the last of the fall colors before winter set in. He watched children chasing each other, parents calling out warnings and encouragement. Near the playground, a familiar voice caught his attention. "Zoe, careful on the monkey bars." Ethan stopped. A few yards away stood Zariah, bundled in a practical coat, watching a young girl navigate the playground equipment. The child had her mother's eyes and confident smile, even as she tackled the challenging bars. He debated walking away before she noticed him. This chance encounter felt like an invasion of her private life, but before he could retreat, Zariah turned and saw him. Her expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "Are you following me, Mr. Langford?" she asked as he approached. "No," he assured her. "Just taking a walk. I live nearby." She seemed to accept this, turning her attention back to her daughter. "Zoe, 5 more minutes, then we need to head home." "Is that your daughter?" Ethan asked, though it was obvious. "Yes, Zoe's my whole world." As if hearing her name, the girl looked over and waved. Zariah waved back with a smile that transformed her face, the first genuine smile Ethan had seen from her. "She seems like a great kid," he said. "She is." Zariah's voice softened. "Too smart for her own good sometimes." Already reading 2 grade levels ahead. Pride shone in her eyes, and Ethan felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Not envy exactly, but awareness of what was missing in his own life. "Have you looked over the job description?" he asked, changing the subject. "I have," she nodded. "The position itself is perfect. It aligns with my experience and what I want to be doing. But I'm still not sure I can trust your motives," she admitted, "or that this opportunity won't disappear as quickly as it appeared." Ethan watched Zoe swing from bar to bar, her face determined. "I understand your hesitation, but I hope you'll give me a chance to prove otherwise." Zariah studied him for a long moment. "I'll let you know tomorrow." Zoe jumped down from the monkey bars and ran over. "Mom, who's this?" "This is Mr. Langford," Zariah said. "He runs a big company." "Bigger than your building?" Zoe asked, looking up at Ethan with curious eyes. "My building?" "Where Mom works. She says it's the tallest building she's ever been in." Ethan smiled. "Yes, quite a bit bigger." "Do you have kids?" Zoe asked directly. "Zoe," Zariah warned. "That's personal." "It's fine," Ethan assured her. "No, I don't have any children." "That's sad," Zoe declared with a child's brutal honesty. "Mom says having me is the best thing that ever happened to her." Zariah looked embarrassed. "Zoe, we need to go. I've got that catering shift tonight." "On Sunday?" Ethan asked before he could stop himself. "Weekend events pay better," she said simply. "My neighbor watches Zoe." Ethan felt another twist of discomfort. While he spent his Sundays reading reports in his penthouse, she was working a 3rd job. "I should let you go," he said. "It was nice meeting you, Zoe." "Nice meeting you too," the girl replied, already distracted by a dog walking past. Zariah nodded goodbye, taking her daughter's hand. Ethan watched them walk away, the mother and daughter, talking animatedly. Something about the scene stayed with him as he continued his walk, a sense of life being lived fully despite challenges. The next morning, Patricia knocked on his office door. "Zariah Bennett is on line 1, she said, giving him a meaningful look. "She says she has an answer for you." Ethan picked up the phone, aware that his pulse had quickened. "Ms. Bennett, I've decided to accept your offer," Zariah said. "I can start in 2 weeks after giving notice at my current positions." Relief washed over him. "That's excellent news. Patricia will handle all the paperwork. Is there anything you need before you start?" "Just clarity," she replied. "I'm taking this job because it's an opportunity I can't pass up for my daughter's future, but I want boundaries, Mr. Langford. This is a professional relationship." Her directness caught him off guard. "Of course, I wouldn't expect anything else." After they hung up, Ethan sat back in his chair. He wasn't sure why her comment about boundaries bothered him. Of course, this was professional. What else would it be? The 2 weeks passed quickly. Ethan threw himself into merger integration work, trying not to think about Zariah's impending start date. He directed Patricia to assign her a corner office on the executive floor, something that raised eyebrows among some of his long-time executives. "She's untested," his CFO Richard commented during a leadership meeting. "Shouldn't she prove herself before getting such a prominent office?" "The community relations director needs to be seen as having the full support of leadership," Ethan replied firmly. "The office placement sends that message." Richard didn't look convinced, but knew better than to argue further. On Zariah's first day, Ethan deliberately stayed away. He didn't want her to think he was hovering or giving her special attention. Patricia reported that the onboarding was going smoothly. "She's meeting with all the department heads today," Patricia said. "She seems very focused, very professional." "Good," Ethan nodded. "Let me know if she needs anything." But by the end of the week, he was growing curious. Reports from various executives mentioned how quickly Zariah was getting up to speed, how she asked insightful questions and was already proposing improvements to their community programs. Friday afternoon, Ethan decided to check in personally. He found Zariah in her office, walls already covered with maps of the city showing community demographics and areas where the company had existing programs. She looked up when he knocked. "Mr. Langford, come in." "How's your first week been?" he asked, remaining in the doorway. "Busy," she said with a small smile, "but good. Your team has been helpful, especially Patricia. I'm glad to hear it." He gestured to the maps. "You've been working on something already?" Zariah stood and walked to one of the maps. "I've been analyzing where your current charitable efforts are concentrated. There are some clear gaps." She pointed to several neighborhoods highlighted in red. "These areas have the highest needs but receive the least support from Langford Enterprises." Ethan moved closer to examine the map. "That's concerning." "It's common," Zariah said. "Companies tend to support areas where they have business interests or where executives live. I'm proposing a more balanced approach." Her confidence impressed him. Just 1 week and she was already challenging the company's long-standing practices. "I'd like to see your full proposal when it's ready," he said. "I'll have a draft by next Friday," she promised. "I want to visit some of these neighborhoods first." "Talk to community leaders," Ethan nodded. "Whatever resources you need, just ask." As he turned to leave, he noticed a small framed photo on her desk, Zariah and Zoe at what looked like a school function, both beaming at the camera. "How's Zoe adjusting to your new schedule?" he asked. Zariah's expression softened at her daughter's name. "She loves that I'm home for dinner every night now, and the company daycare is amazing, much better than the after-school program she was in before." "Good," Ethan said, genuinely pleased. "Well, I won't keep you. Have a good weekend." Back in his office, Ethan found himself smiling. Zariah was exactly what the company needed, someone who saw beyond the corporate bubble and understood the real world outside. Over the next few weeks, Zariah's influence began to spread throughout the company. Her first presentation to the executive team was met with surprised respect. She had done her research, understood the business implications of her proposals, and presented everything with confidence and clarity. Even Richard, initially skeptical, approached Ethan after the meeting. "She's impressive. Where did you find her?" Ethan didn't mention the taxi ride. "She was in our candidate pool from a previous search. I realized we'd missed an opportunity." By the end of her first month, Zariah had established herself as a valuable member of the leadership team. Ethan made a point of treating her like any other executive, checking in regularly but not micromanaging, inviting her to key meetings, considering her input seriously. But there was something different about their interactions, a tension he couldn't quite name. Sometimes he would look up during a meeting to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Other times, their eyes would meet across the room, and he would feel an unexpected connection before. One of them looked away. December arrived, bringing holiday preparations throughout the office. Langford Enterprises always hosted a lavish Christmas party at a top hotel, an event that made the society pages and was attended by clients, business partners, and city leaders. "The party committee needs to know if you're bringing a guest this year," Patricia reminded him one morning. Ethan almost laughed. He never brought anyone. "No, just me as usual. They also need to know about Ms. Bennett. Should I ask her?" "Yes, please," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. He found himself wondering if Zariah would bring a date. She never mentioned a partner, but that didn't mean there wasn't someone in her life. Later that day, he passed Zariah in the hallway as she was on the phone. Her expression was worried, and she barely noticed him as she hurried back to her office. An hour later, Patricia knocked on his door. "Zariah just called. She needs to leave early, some emergency with her daughter." Ethan felt a stab of concern. "Is Zoe all right?" She didn't say, just that she had to pick her up from school immediately. Ethan tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting to Zariah and Zoe. Before he realized what he was doing, he'd picked up the phone and called Zariah's cell. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding stressed. "Mr. Langford, I heard you. Had to leave for an emergency. Is everything okay with Zoe?" There was a pause as if his concern had surprised her. "Her asthma flared up at school. I'm at the doctor's office now. Is there anything you need? Anything I can do?" "No, but thank you for asking." Her voice softened slightly. "The doctor says she'll be fine. It's just scary when it happens." "Of course," Ethan said. "Take whatever time you need. Your daughter comes first." After hanging up, Ethan sat at his desk, troubled by how worried he felt. This wasn't just professional concern. For an employee, somewhere along the way, Zariah and Zoe had begun to matter to him. Personally, the realization was unsettling. The next morning, Zariah came to his office. "I wanted to thank you for your call yesterday," she said, standing in his doorway, "and for understanding about my leaving suddenly. How's Zoe?" "Better." The doctor adjusted her medication. Zariah hesitated, then added, "She asked about you, actually." "Me?" Ethan was surprised. "She remembers meeting you in the park. She wanted to know if the tall man who runs the big company knew I had to leave work." Ethan smiled at the description. "Smart kid keeping track of her mom's boss. Too smart sometimes," Zariah agreed with a small laugh. It was a warm sound that Ethan realized he'd never heard before. An awkward silence fell between them. "Patricia mentioned the holiday party," Zariah said finally. "I've never been to something so formal. What should I expect?" "It's elaborate," Ethan admitted. "Black tie, 5-course dinner, dancing. The company goes all out." "Dancing," Zariah repeated, looking uncertain. "You don't have to dance," Ethan assured her. "Many people just network and enjoy the food." Zariah nodded. "Are you bringing someone special?" The question caught him off guard. "No, I never do." "Never? That's hard to believe." "Why is that hard to believe?" he asked, genuinely curious. Zariah seemed to realize she'd moved into personal territory. "No reason. I should get back to work. I have those community center visits today." As she turned to leave, Ethan found himself not wanting the conversation to end. "Will you be bringing someone to the party?" She stopped in the doorway. "No." It's just me. Their eyes met, and Ethan felt that strange connection again, something unspoken passing between them. It's just me too, he said softly. Zariah held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the empty doorway. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to the company holiday party. The high night of the holiday party arrived with a light snowfall that dusted the city like powdered sugar. Ethan stood before his mirror, adjusting his bow tie. He'd attended this event for 15 years, always focused on the business connections to be made, the deals to be discussed over champagne. Tonight felt different. His phone chimed with a text from his driver. "Car ready whenever you are, sir." Ethan took one last look in the mirror, straightened his jacket and headed downstairs. The Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom was transformed for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above tables adorned with elaborate holiday centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while waiters circulated with trays of champagne. "Ethan, there you are." Richard approached with his wife on his arm. "Spectacular event as always." Ethan nodded, accepting their compliments while his eyes scanned the growing crowd. No sign of Zariah yet. For the next hour he circulated through the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on the year's successes, discussing plans for the coming year. But his attention kept drifting to the entrance. And then she was there. Zariah stood in the doorway, a vision in a deep blue gown that hugged her curves before flowing to the floor. Her hair was swept up, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She looked uncertain until Patricia spotted her and hurried over to welcome her. Ethan excused himself from a conversation with a board member and made his way across the room. "Miss Bennett," he said, approaching. "You look lovely." A hint of color touched her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Langford. This is quite an event." "It's a Langford tradition," he said. "Would you like a tour?" Zariah nodded, and he guided her through the ballroom, introducing her to key clients and partners. She impressed him with how easily she engaged with everyone, how quickly she remembered names and details about their businesses. "You're a natural at this," he commented as they paused near the bar. "I've worked enough catering events to know how these things operate," she said with a small smile, just from a different perspective. The reminder of her previous jobs, of how recently she'd been serving at events like this rather than attending them, created a momentary awkwardness. "Zariah!" A voice broke the tension. Patricia approached with a tall, distinguished man. "I want you to meet Judge Williams. He's very interested in our new community initiatives." As Zariah turned to speak with the judge, Ethan stepped away to give them space. Throughout dinner, he found his attention repeatedly drawn to her table, where she was engaged in animated conversation with a group of influential community leaders. After the meal, the band began playing and couples moved to the dance floor. Ethan circulated among his guests, but his eyes kept finding Zariah. She was standing alone by one of the tall windows, watching the dancers. Without fully deciding to do so, Ethan found himself walking toward her. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. Zariah looked surprised. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Langford. It's a company party," he said, "and it's just a dance." She hesitated, then nodded. "One dance." On the dance floor, Ethan placed one hand lightly on her waist, took her hand with the other. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, maintaining a proper distance between them. "You're a good dancer," she said as they moved with the music. "My mother insisted on lessons," he admitted. "She said no son of hers would embarrass himself at formal events." "She sounds formidable." "She was," Ethan said, feeling the familiar pang when speaking of his parents. "Both my parents were. They built the company from nothing. And you've taken it to new heights," Zariah observed. "They would be proud." "I hope so." He guided her through a turn. "What about your parents? Are they in New York?" Zariah's expression closed slightly. "My mother lives in Philadelphia. We're not close." "And your father?" "He wasn't in the picture." Her tone made it clear the subject was closed. They danced in silence for a moment. "Zoe seems like an amazing child," Ethan said, changing the subject. "You've done a wonderful job with her." Zariah's face softened at the mention of her daughter. "She's everything to me. Everything I do is for her future." She's lucky to have such a devoted mother. I'm the lucky one." Zariah's eyes met his, and Ethan felt that now familiar connection spark between them. The music ended, but they remained still for a moment, looking at each other. "Thank you for the dance," Zariah said, stepping back. "My pleasure." Ethan reluctantly released her hand. "Would you like some champagne?" Before she could answer, Patricia appeared at his side. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but the mayor just arrived and is asking to speak with you." Ethan nodded. "Of course. Excuse me, Ms. Bennett." For the rest of the evening, Ethan was pulled into one conversation after another. He caught glimpses of Zariah speaking with various executives and community leaders, always poised, always impressive. Later, as the party was winding down, he spotted her collecting her wrap from the coat check. "Leaving already?" he asked, approaching. "Yes, my neighbor is watching Zoe. I don't want to be too late." "Let me have my driver take you home," he offered. "That's not necessary," she said. "I can get a cab." "It's snowing and cabs will be scarce. Please, I insist." After a moment's hesitation, she agreed. "Thank you." Outside, his driver held the door as they slid into the warm back seat of the town car. "Where to, Miss Bennett?" the driver asked. "Riverside and 137th, she said. Ethan looked at her in surprise. "That's nearly an hour from the office." "The rent is more affordable uptown," she explained simply. They rode in silence for a while, the city sliding past the windows, snow falling more heavily now. "You made quite an impression tonight," Ethan said finally. "The mayor mentioned I was impressed by your plans for youth programs in underserved neighborhoods." "He seemed genuinely interested," Zariah agreed. "It could be a powerful partnership." "You've accomplished more in 6 weeks than the last community director did in 2 years. Zariah smiled slightly. "I have motivation." "Zoe," Ethan said, understanding. "Partly." She looked out the window. "But also, I have something to prove." "To me?" he asked quietly. She turned to face him. "To myself. That I belong in that room. That I deserve a seat at that table." "You more than deserve it," Ethan said. "You've earned it." Their eyes held, and in the dim light of the car, with snow falling outside and the city quiet around them, Ethan felt an almost overwhelming urge to reach for her hand. The car stopped. "We've arrived, Miss Bennett," the driver announced. The moment. Broken, Zariah gathered her wrap. "Thank you for the ride, and for a lovely evening." "Zariah," Ethan said, using her first name for the first time. "Good night, Mr. Langford," she interrupted gently, opening the door and stepping out into the snow. Ethan watched her walk to her building, a blue silhouette against the white night before the car pulled away. When he arrived home, his penthouse felt emptier than ever. The next morning, Saturday, Ethan woke early despite the late night. He couldn't stop thinking about Zariah, the feeling of her in his arms as they danced, the almost moment in the car. This was dangerous territory. She worked for him. There were boundaries, as she had made clear from the beginning. Still, he found himself dressing with unusual care before heading to the office. It was unlikely she would be there on a Saturday, but some part of him hoped. The office was quiet, just a few dedicated employees working on year-end projects. Ethan headed to his office, disappointed but not surprised that Zariah's office was dark. He worked through the morning, forcing himself to focus on quarterly projections. Around noon, he heard a sound in the hallway and looked up to see Zariah walking past, carrying files. Without thinking, he stood and went to his door. "Ms. Bennett, working on Saturday." She turned, looking surprised to see him. "Mr. Langford, yes, I wanted to finalize the community grant proposals before the holiday break. Have you had lunch?" The question came out before he could consider it. "Not yet. Neither have I. Would you join me? We could discuss the proposals." Zariah hesitated, and Ethan quickly added, "The cafeteria is open. Nothing formal." "All right," she agreed. "Give me 15 minutes to finish something." In the cafeteria, they were the only executives present. They went through the line, Ethan insisting on paying for both meals despite Zariah's protests. "Consider diet a business lunch," he said as they found a table by the window. They discussed work as they ate, the grant proposals, plans for expanding the youth programs, a new partnership with a tech education nonprofit. But gradually the conversation shifted to more personal topics. "How did you get into community relations work?" Ethan asked. "I started as a volunteer at a community center in my neighborhood," Zariah explained. "When Zoe was a baby, I used their childcare while taking night classes. I wanted to give back, so I helped with grant writing. Turned out I had a knack for it. And Zoe's father, is he involved in her life?" Ethan knew he was crossing a line with the question, but he couldn't help himself. Zariah's expression tightened. "No. He left when I told him I was pregnant. We were both in college. He chose to continue his education. I chose my child." "I'm sorry," Ethan said sincerely. "Don't be. I've never regretted my choice. Not for a second." Ethan nodded, admiring her strength. "And you still finished your degree?" "It took longer," she said with a small smile. "But yes, one class at a time, with Zoe sleeping in her carrier beside me while I studied." The image was powerful. Young Zariah determined to create a better life, baby at her side. "What about you?" she asked. "You've built this amazing company, but do you have a life outside of it?" The question caught him off guard. "Not much of one," he admitted. "The company has been my focus since my parents died." "That sounds lonely," Zariah said softly. Their eyes met across the table, and Ethan felt that pull again, the desire to be closer to her, to break down the professional walls between them. "It has been," he said honestly. "Until recently." Zariah looked down at her plate. "Mr. Langford, please, call me Ethan, at least when we're not in a formal meeting." She nodded slowly. "Ethan, we need to be careful. You're my boss." "I know." He sighed. "And I respect the boundaries you've set, but I can't deny that I enjoy your company, not just professionally." "I enjoy yours too," she admitted, "but that doesn't change our situation." Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Richard calling about an urgent issue with the merger. Reluctantly, he excused himself. "I need to take this, I'm sorry." Zariah stood. "It's fine, I should get back to work anyway." He watched her go, feeling the moment slip away. The next week was the last before the holiday break. The office was filled with festive decorations and employees were in good spirits. Ethan found himself looking for excuses to see Zariah, scheduling extra meetings, stopping by her office with questions that could have been handled by email. On the last day before the break, he came to a decision. He would ask her to dinner, not as her boss, but as a man interested in getting to know her better. If she said no, he would respect that and maintain a strictly professional relationship. But before he could find her, Patricia knocked on his door. "Zariah just called. She won't be in today. Zoe is sick again." Concern immediately replaced Ethan's plans. "How serious is it?" She didn't say, just that she's taking her to the doctor and won't be able to come in. Ethan tried calling Zariah, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Throughout the day, he found himself distracted, wondering about Zoe, wishing he could do something to help. By evening, he still hadn't heard anything. The office was almost empty, most employees having left early for holiday celebrations. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his phone, debating whether to try calling again. Instead, he made a different decision. An hour later, he stood outside Zariah's apartment building, balancing a large gift basket filled with children's books, a soft blanket, hot chocolate mix, and various treats. He'd asked Patricia to have it prepared, saying it was for an important client's child. Now feeling somewhat foolish, he pressed Zariah's apartment number on the intercom. "Yes?" Her voice sounded tired. "Zariah, it's Ethan Langford. I brought something for Zoe." There was a long pause before she buzzed him in. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, a walk-up in an older building. The hallway was clean but worn, paint chipping in places. Zariah opened the door before he could knock, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't read. She was dressed casually in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Even without makeup, she was beautiful. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I was worried," he admitted. "When I heard Zoe was sick again, I thought, well, I brought her some things that might cheer her up. Zariah looked at the elaborate basket, then back at his face. You didn't need to do that. I wanted to. He held out the basket. How is she? Zariah's expression softened. Better now. The doctor adjusted her medication again. She's resting. She stepped back, opening the door wider. Would you like to come in? Just for a minute. The apartment was small but comfortable, a tiny living room connected to an equally small kitchen. Photos of Zoe at various ages covered one wall. Everything was neat and clean, but Ethan could see the signs of struggle, the second-hand furniture, the carefully mended curtains. This is very kind of you, Zariah said, setting the basket on the coffee table, but unnecessary. I wanted to do something, Ethan said. I felt helpless. She studied him. Why do you care so much about me, about Zoe? It was the question he'd been asking himself for weeks. I don't know, he answered honestly. But I do. More than I should, probably. Before she could respond, a small voice called from another room. Mum, who's here? It's Mr. Langford from my work, Zariah called back. He brought you something. Can I see? Zoe appeared in a doorway wearing pajamas covered in stars. Her eyes lit up when she saw the basket. Is that for me? It is, Ethan said, smiling. I heard you weren't feeling well. Zoe approached, examining the basket with delight. Look, Mom, books and hot chocolate. What do you say? Zariah prompted. Thank you, Mr. Langford, Zoe said, already pulling out a book. Will you read to me? Mom says I need to rest, but I'm bored. Zoe, Zariah said gently. Mr. Langford probably needs to go. Actually, Ethan said, I'd be happy to read to you if it's okay with your mom. Zariah hesitated, then nodded. One book. Then you need to rest, Zoe. Zoe grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him toward a small sofa. This one first, she said, holding up a colorful picture book. Ethan sat beside her, awkward at first, then relaxing as he began to read. Zoe leaned against his side, looking at the pictures, occasionally asking questions. Zariah watched from the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. When the story ended, Zoe yawned. One more? Tomorrow, Zariah said, firmly. Time for medicine and bed. Will you come back tomorrow, Mr. Langford? Zoe asked, looking up at him with hopeful eyes. Ethan glanced at Zariah, seeing the conflict on her face. That's up to your mom. We'll see, Zariah said diplomatically. Now say goodnight. Good night, Mr. Langford. Thank you for my basket. You're welcome, Zoe. Feel better. When Zariah returned from putting Zoe to bed, she found Ethan standing by the window looking out at the street below. She's a special child, he said without turning. Yes, she is. Zariah moved to stand beside him. Thank you for the basket. It means a lot to her. And to you? He asked, turning to face her. I'm not used to people caring, she admitted. It's been just Zoe and me for so long. I care, Zariah. Ethan took a step closer. More than I expected to. More than makes sense, given how little time we've known each other. This is complicated, she said softly. You're my boss. I have Zoe to think about. I know. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. But some things are worth complicating your life for. Their eyes met, and this time, neither looked away. Slowly, giving her time to stop him, Ethan leaned forward and touched his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning. For a moment, Zariah didn't respond. Then her lips softened against his, her free hand coming up to rest lightly on his chest. When they broke apart, both were breathing a little faster. I should go, Ethan said, still holding her hand. But I'd like to see both of you again, not as your boss, just as me. Zariah looked at him for a long moment, conflict clear in her eyes. The company has rules about relationships between managers and employees. There are ways to address that, he said, if that's what we both want. Is it what you want? She asked quietly. Yes, he said without hesitation. I want to see where this might lead. Do you? Zariah took a deep breath. I need time to think. This isn't just about me. Ethan nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. He let go of her hand and moved toward the door. Merry Christmas, Zariah. Merry Christmas, Ethan, she replied softly as he stepped into the hallway. As he walked back to his waiting car, snow beginning to fall again, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. Whatever happened next, something important had changed tonight. For the first time in a very long time, he had something in his life that mattered more than work. Someone who made him feel alive again, and that was worth any complication. Christmas morning arrived bright and clear, the city blanketed in fresh snow. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the small stack of presents under his tasteful but impersonal tree. They were gifts from business associates and clients, expensive bottles of scotch, leather-bound planners, luxury items he didn't need. None were from anyone who truly knew him. His phone chimed with a text message. Expecting holiday wishes from Patricia, or one of the executives, he was surprised to see Zariah's name on the screen. Zoe wants to know if you'd like to come over this afternoon. No pressure. We understand if you have plans. Ethan's heart skipped. He'd been prepared to wait through the holidays, to give Zariah the time she'd asked for. This invitation was unexpected. I'd love to, he replied immediately. What time, and can I bring anything? Around 3, just yourself, unless you want to join our hot chocolate marathon. Wouldn't miss it, he texted back. See you at 3. For the first time in years, Christmas felt like Christmas again. When Ethan arrived at Zariah's apartment, he carried a small bag of gifts. Nothing extravagant, but thoughtfully chosen. He'd spent the morning searching open stores for the perfect presents. Zoe answered the door, her face lighting up. Mr. Langford, you came. Of course I did, he said, stepping inside. And please, call me Ethan. The apartment was transformed from his previous visit. A small Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, decorated with what looked like handmade ornaments. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, and delicious smells came from the kitchen. Zariah appeared wearing a festive red sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. Merry Christmas. I hope you haven't already had lunch. I made too much food. I haven't, Ethan said, taking in the warm, homey scene. And it smells amazing. Mom makes the best Christmas turkey, Zoe announced, and we have 3 kinds of pie. 3? Ethan raised his eyebrows at Zariah. She shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. I may have gone overboard. I brought a few things, Ethan said, holding out the bag. You didn't need to bring gifts, Zariah protested. Nothing big, he assured her, just some small things. They moved to the living room, where Zoe eagerly distributed the presents. For himself, Ethan had brought a board game they could all play together. For Zariah, a beautiful leather-bound journal and an elegant pen, and for Zoe, a children's space encyclopedia she'd mentioned wanting when he read to her, along with a small jewelry box containing a silver bracelet with a star charm. Because you're already reaching for the stars, he told her as she admired it. Zoe hugged him impulsively, and Ethan found himself blinking back unexpected tears. We have something for you too, Zariah said, handing him a wrapped package. Inside was a hand-knit scarf in deep blue. Zoe picked the color, Zariah explained. I made it. You knit? Ethan asked, surprised. It keeps my hands busy in taxi cabs between fares, she said, or it used to. It's perfect, he said sincerely, wrapping it around his neck. Thank you both. The afternoon passed in a blur of good food, games, and laughter. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed Christmas so much. Perhaps not since his parents were alive. Later, after Zoe had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the excitement, Ethan and Zariah sat at the kitchen table, mugs of hot chocolate between them. Thank you for inviting me today, Ethan said quietly. It meant a lot. It was Zoe's idea, Zariah admitted. She hasn't stopped talking about you since your visit. And you? What have you been thinking about? Zariah met his eyes. About how complicated this is, about whether it's worth the risk. And? His heart thumped in his chest. And I think maybe... It is. She reached across the table and took his hand. But we need to be smart about it. For Zoe's sake, for both our sakes. Whatever you need, Ethan said, squeezing her hand. We can take it slow. There's something else, Zariah said, her expression growing serious. If we're going to try this, to be together, I can't keep working directly for you. It's not right, and it would undermine everything I've worked for. Ethan had expected this. I agree. We have a few options. We could transfer you to report to the COO instead of me. Or, she prompted, or we could look at something more significant. A foundation separate from the company but funded by it. You would run it independently, build it from the ground up. Zariah's eyes widened. A foundation? We've discussed it at the board level for years, but never had the right person to lead it. Ethan leaned forward. You could do more good there than within the corporate structure. Complete autonomy, bigger budget, direct impact. You've thought about this, she said, looking impressed. I have, he admitted, but only if it's what you want. Your career matters to me, Zariah. I would never want to derail it. She squeezed his hand. Let me think about it. Of course. They talked late into the night, planning, dreaming, getting to know each other better. When Ethan finally left, the city quiet under its blanket of snow, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a happy blur. Ethan spent every free moment with Zariah and Zoe, taking them ice skating in Central Park, visiting the Natural History Museum, enjoying simple meals in Zariah's apartment. On New Year's Eve, Patricia hosted a small gathering at her home for the executive team. Ethan arrived with Zariah, their first public appearance as a couple among his colleagues. There were raised eyebrows and curious glances, but Patricia had prepared everyone. She had known about Ethan's growing feelings for Zariah long before he admitted them to himself. It's about time you found someone, Richard told him privately. She's impressive, don't mess it up. As midnight approached, Ethan and Zariah stood on Patricia's balcony watching the city lights. I've been thinking about your foundation idea, Zariah said. I want to do it, Ethan smiled. Really? Yes. But I want to earn it. She turned to face him fully. I'll continue in my current role for 6 months, prove myself beyond any doubt, then make the transition. You've already proven yourself, Ethan objected. To you, maybe, but not to everyone. Not to myself. Her expression was determined. I need to do this my way. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand, and I respect it. Inside, the countdown to midnight began. They could hear the voices chanting, 10, 9, 8. I have a feeling this is going to be a very good year, Ethan said softly. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. As fireworks exploded over the city, Ethan pulled Zariah close and kissed her, not caring who saw. This was no longer something to hide. This was something to celebrate. The winter passed quickly, with Ethan and Zariah settling into a relationship that surprised them both with its ease. Zoe blossomed under Ethan's attention, showing him a world he'd never known. School projects, children's birthday parties, bedtime stories. At work, they maintained professional boundaries, but everyone knew. Zariah was careful to never use their relationship to her advantage, often being harder on her own projects than necessary to prove her worth. In March, when the first hints of spring touched the city, Zariah was asked to present her community initiatives to the board of directors. Her programs had shown remarkable success, generating positive press and goodwill throughout the city. Ethan sat proudly as she walked the board through the results, answering their questions with confidence and insight. When the chairman himself congratulated her on her vision, Ethan knew the 6-month timeline she'd set might be shortened. That weekend, they took Zoe to the Bronx Zoo, one of her favorite places. As she ran ahead to see the penguins, Ethan took Zariah's hand. The board was impressed yesterday, very impressed. I noticed, she said with a smile, the chairman actually knew my name. They're talking about accelerating the foundation plans, Ethan told her. If you're ready. Zariah stopped walking. Really, how soon? Next month, potentially. Full funding, full autonomy. She looked stunned. That's amazing. You've earned it, Ethan said simply. They see what I've seen all along. Zariah squeezed his hand. Thank you for believing in me. From the beginning. Not from the beginning, he corrected. That's the point. I didn't believe in you when I should have. I almost missed seeing how extraordinary you are." They continued walking, finding Zoe pressed against the glass of the penguin exhibit, her face alight with wonder. "She adores you," Zariah said softly. "She's never had a father figure before." "I adore her too," Ethan replied. "Both of you." That night, after Zoe was asleep, they sat on Zariah's small balcony looking at the stars. "I've been thinking," Ethan said carefully. "My apartment is so big for one person, and you both spend so much time there already." Zariah looked at him sharply. "Are you asking us to move in with you?" "Only if you're ready," he said quickly. "I know it's a big step, especially for Zoe." "It is," she agreed, "but it's also practical. The commute from here is brutal, and Zoe would be closer to her school." "Is that a yes?" Ethan asked hopefully. Zariah smiled. Let's talk to Zoe about it and see how she feels." The next morning, over pancakes, they broached the subject with Zoe. "How would you feel about us moving to Ethan's apartment?" Zariah asked. "We'd still keep this place, but we'd stay with him most of the time." Zoe considered this seriously. "Would I have my own room?" "Absolutely," Ethan assured her. "You could decorate it however you want." "And would you still read me stories at night?" "Every night," he promised. Zoe nodded decisively. "Okay, but can we bring my star lamp? And all my books?" "All of them," Zariah promised, exchanging a relieved smile with Ethan. By April, the Langford Foundation was officially announced, with Zariah Bennett named as its executive director. The press coverage was extensive, focusing on the foundation's ambitious plans to address education gaps, healthcare access, and economic opportunities in underserved communities. What the press didn't report was the personal happiness behind the professional announcement. Zariah and Zoe had moved into Ethan's penthouse, transforming the once sterile space into a warm home filled with laughter, books, and children's artwork on the refrigerator. One evening in May, Ethan came home to find Zariah on the balcony, looking out over the city as the sun set. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, joining her. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in a year," she said. "Last May I was driving a taxi at night and worrying about making rent. And now," he prompted, "now I'm running a foundation with a $50 million budget," she smiled up at him. "And living with a man I once thought represented everything." "Wrong with corporate America," Ethan laughed. "Was I really that bad?" "You were," she considered her words, "blind to your privilege, to the realities most people face. And now? Now you see." She turned to face him fully. "That's what I love about you, Ethan. Once you see something, you do something about it." "What you just said," he spoke softly. "That you love me, did you mean it?" Zariah nodded. "I do love you, I have for a while now." "I love you too," Ethan said, pulling her close, "more than I ever thought possible." They stood together, watching the city lights come on one by one. "Do you ever think about that night?" Zariah asked. "When you got into my taxi?" "All the time," Ethan admitted. "How close I came to never knowing you, to never knowing this life could exist." "It was meant to be," she said simply. "Some things are." A week later, Zariah came home from work to find the penthouse transformed. Rose petals led from the elevator to the balcony, where Ethan waited, beside a table set for two. Candles flickered in the early evening light and soft music played. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling as she approached. "A celebration," Ethan said, taking her hands. "The foundation's first major grant was approved. Today." "I know," Zariah laughed. "I'm the one who submitted it." "That's not the only thing we're celebrating." His expression grew serious. "Zariah, meeting you changed everything for me. You showed me what really matters in life. You and Zoe have given me the family I never thought I'd have." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Oh my God," Zariah whispered, her eyes widening. Ethan opened the box to reveal a stunning ring, an emerald surrounded by diamonds. "It reminded me of your eyes," he explained. "The first thing I noticed about you in the rearview mirror that night." He dropped to one knee. "Zariah Bennett, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes. "What about Zoe? Have you asked her?" Ethan smiled. "I did. Yesterday. She said yes, but that I had to promise to adopt her officially so she could have. The same last name as both of us. You want to adopt her? Zariah's voice broke with emotion. More than anything, Ethan said sincerely. I already love her as my own. Then yes, Zariah said through her tears. Yes, to all of it. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, they heard a small squeal from inside the apartment. Zoe came running out, unable to contain herself any longer. Did you say yes? She demanded, bouncing with excitement. Is Ethan going to be my dad for real now? Zariah laughed, picking up her daughter and bringing her into their embrace. Yes, baby. He's going to be your dad for real. And we're going to be a real family? Zoe asked, looking between them. So we already are, Ethan told her, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. We already are. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Ethan and Zariah stood on the balcony again, her ring catching the moonlight. A year ago, I would never have believed this was possible, Zariah said. That night in the taxi, when I recognized you, I was so angry. All I could think about was how you'd rejected me, how different our lives were. And now, Ethan asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, now I see it differently. She leaned back against him. That rejection led me down a path that eventually brought us here. Everything happened exactly as it needed to, even the part where I was an arrogant CEO who couldn't see what was right in front of him. Especially that part, she teased. It makes our story more interesting. Ethan turned her to face him. Our story is just beginning. As he kissed her under the stars, Ethan marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. One chance. An encounter. One opportunity to make things right. One heart brave enough to take a risk on love. In the penthouse behind them, Zoe slept peacefully, dreaming of her new family. And in the city below, thousands of taxis moved through the streets, carrying people whose lives might change in an instant, just as theirs had. All it took was the courage to see each other, really see each other. And the rest, as they say, is history, or in their case, just the beginning. The end.